Welcome, Doctor.
Oh, thank you.
I particularly like the title of your novel, The Wounds of the Dead, and I guess it's published with another name in US, Night Theater. So shall we start the session by talking about why these two titles?
Sure. So I guess first things first, am I audible to everyone in the audience? Can you hear me? Okay, excellent. So yes, the novel that you mentioned was published in India with the title The Wounds of the Dead, and it's going to be released in the UK and the US in the different title, as you mentioned, Night Theater. So actually, as you will see, you'll see why I titled it "The Wounds of the Dead" from the reading that I would do. But when I found a publisher in the UK, the publisher felt that he wanted a title that was a little more oblique, and the entire book takes place over the course of one night, most of it takes place actually in an operating theater. And so it's called Night Theater, but also the book actually has a very limited cast of characters, and so it also would work as a stage play. And so they came up with the title of Night Theater, which I also like very much. So perhaps I can start by talking about a little bit about the book, and then I can read an excerpt. So The Wounds of the Dead is set in a government clinic in rural India. The name of the city, the village itself is unnamed, but you can imagine it's somewhere in rural Maharashtra. And the characters themselves are also unnamed. They are referred to by their professions, by their identity, by their gender, but they don't have any names. So the main character in the book is an aging surgeon. He's referred to just as the surgeon. And he works in this clinic in this little 4-room government clinic where there are absolutely no resources, but he's constantly dealing with government corruption. He has no money to keep the clinic running, so he's spending from his own pocket. And he really doesn't even have a nurse. He just has a village girl who acts as the pharmacist, but she doesn't have any pharmacy training. She's just 7th standard pass. And in these circumstances, he's struggling with his work. And the book begins on a particularly difficult day when there's been a polio vaccine drive, but the official who's supposed to deliver the polio vaccines doesn't show up until much later in the day. It really inconveniences everyone. The surgeon is again at the end of his tether. And on top of that, the official tries to get the surgeon to bribe him. And so that completely fills him with a sense of frustration. And the chapter 1 ends with the surgeon deciding that he's done with this place. He doesn't want to live here anymore and take care of the patients in this village anymore. And so he says, from this day on, not a paisa of his own money would be spent on this place. Whatever he could arrange for, he would leave. The official who's been trying to bribe him would take this bloody clinic and turn it into a tomb. And so with that, in that setting, chapter number 2 begins, which I'll read out. The surgeon, let me see. Thank you. The surgeon, his head buried in a ledger, was adding a long string of numbers when someone said, "Dr. Sahib?" The nib of his pen halted, and he watched an inky halo blossom around it and spread through the cheap paper. The calculations in his mind evaporated. He looked up. There were visitors in his doorway. He hadn't heard them step into the clinic. "The polio drive is over. The vaccine's all finished. Nothing left." With his pen, the surgeon pointed at the boy, an oval-faced child with untidy hair sticking out behind his ears. "How old is your son?" "8," replied the man. "Then he doesn't need this vaccine. It's only for children 5 years and younger." "We aren't here for the vaccine, Dr. Sahib." Fingerprints smudged the surgeon's bifocals. and he had to pick them off his nose and wipe them clean to take a better look. He couldn't remember having seen these people before. The man was slim, his face oval like his son's, but stubbled. The woman standing behind the boy was perhaps a little younger than the man, probably the wife. Her odni was wrapped so strangely around her neck and chin that he couldn't see a Mangal Sutra. "What is it then?" the surgeon asked, returning to his ledger. First the encounter with that official, then his confinement in this room, forcing polio drops into bawling children. It had ground him down to his marrow. And then there was his misplaced perfectionism, his inability to fill the vaccine ledger with meaningless scribbles and be done with it. The ledgers would be filed away in some government archive and never opened again, but still he needed the serial numbers on the invoices to match the boxes to match the aliquots to tally with groups of children. And he was almost done, just 15 minutes without interruption. That was all he needed. Where the hell was the pharmacist anyway? Last he knew, she was in the storeroom, folding cardboard boxes to line the medicine cabinets. Instead of doing her origami, that girl should have stopped these three at the front steps. "It's late," she should have said. "The clinic is closed. Come back tomorrow." But she was nowhere in sight, and so he would have to deal with them himself. "Are you deaf? What do you want?" The visitors flinched. "We need your help," the man said. "This will seem like a strange request." "Strange request? What nonsense is this? Just state your business or get going." Now, finally, the pharmacist rushed in, panicked. "What are you doing here? You can't disturb Sahib like this. Wait outside, wait outside." She began to usher them out. But when the boy moved aside, the surgeon noticed the bulge under the woman's loose clothing. He raised his hand. "Is your wife in labor? Did her water break?" "No, she's almost at term, as you can see. But that's not why we are here. At least, not just that." The man paused, rubbed his mouth with the back of his palm. His eyelids parted further, and he stammered out his next words. We're seriously injured, all three of us, and we need surgeries tonight." The visitor clearly wasn't a bumpkin. He was educated. His choice of words left no doubt of that. But surgeries? Had the surgeon heard him right? What could the man possibly... "Show me," said the surgeon. Like merchants displaying their wares, the boy rolled up his vest, and the man unbuttoned his shirt and lifted his right arm over his head. In the man's side was a slit, its edges white and still, like lips paused in speech. It was enough to fool one into thinking that the ribs had been penetrated. The boy's abdomen was bloated. 2 cuts in the upper left under the rib cage formed a cross whose corners curled outwards. And then the woman finished peeling away the many loops of odni wrapped around her neck. It couldn't be. He had to be mistaken. The wound in her neck, surely it was a trick of the light. Could those be the ends of her muscles? And was that... No, it was impossible. The larynx? But there was no blood gushing out, not even from that neck. What kind of hoax was this? Who were these charlatans? Out of the corner of his eye, the surgeon saw a jerking motion. It was the pharmacist. The surgeon had forgotten she was still in the room. She looked rigid, as though in the grip of a seizure. The man with the cut in his side sprang to her and grabbed both her wrists with one hand. Stepping behind her, he clapped his other hand over her mouth. She was thin, but seemed to match him in strength as they struggled. He grimaced as he twisted her forearms and muscled her to him, her back against his chest, her torso immobilized by the pressure of his arm folded across her, locking her twitching hands against her shoulder. The air seemed to clot, grow viscous. The surgeon pushed through it, tried to reach the pharmacist. He felt his books fly off the desk as his hand struck them. The woman with the monstrous neck blocked his path, clasped his wrist, pressed a finger to her lips. "Please, Dr. Sahib, please," the man said. "I won't hurt her, won't hurt you. We are good people, we just need your help." "What?" the surgeon began, but could find no suitable words to add. And so he just stood and watched the man signal the boy, watched the boy run to the window, close and latch it, bolt the door, watched the woman go to the pharmacist and reach out to cup her cheek, all the while saying rapidly, calling her sister, begging her not to scream. This was no hoax. The pharmacist, twisting in the captor's grip, arched her body back like a bow at the woman's advance, making the man stumble a step back to maintain his hold on her. The girl's eyelids had opened as far as they could go, and her eyes were fixed on the woman's obscene, mutilated neck. The surgeon felt his own muscles knot and pull at the point where the nerves threaded out from his skull. He pressed his hand on the cold glass plate of the desk behind him. The man with the cut in his neck, cut in his ribs, opened his mouth, but if he said something, the surgeon could not hear it. The woman fell quiet, and probably realizing the effect her injuries were having, raised her odni and let it drape back around her neck, removing her wound from view. The surgeon's eyes darted around the room. Could he use his pen as a weapon? Was it sharp enough? Solid enough? It lay on the floor, its nib snapped off. A spray of ink stretched across the tiles. What else? He had scissors in his drawer somewhere, he was sure, but he'd have to dig for them. He gripped the table's edge tighter, leaned against it. What is this? What's going on? The visitors stood like effigies. The woman and the boy turned to the man, who was opening and closing his mouth like a fish thrown to land. The girl he held captive had stopped her struggle and now just hung against him, breathing heavily with her eyes squeezed shut. He too closed his eyes and heaved, as though gathering his breath for some feat. I am a teacher, Dr. Sahib. This is my family. We have never harmed anyone. We just want to live our lives in peace. So this is the end of chapter 2. In case you haven't gathered so far, the three individuals who have visited the clinic, a man, his pregnant wife, and their 8-year-old son, are dead, and they ask the surgeon to bring them back to life. Their blood is going to start flowing at dawn, and the surgeon is asked to fix their wounds before dawn so that they can return to life. And the rest of the book traces the events of that night, most of which happen in an operating theater.
Like the title, what I found very interesting is the aspect that you have infused so many genres into it. Like there is elements of magical realism, absurd, there are philosophical musings, and it could be a treatise on death. It's a medical drama. So all these things are put together, but when we read the book, you don't feel the weight of all the genres, and it's a very smooth flow. So how did you manage, or was this a conscious effort on your part to bring up all these elements into this?
Oh, well, thanks for saying that. I guess that means the book achieved its effect. I won't say that genre categories do not exist. They do. But I do feel that genre boundaries are probably arbitrary constructs that are produced by the publishing and book marketing industry in order to place books into categories and target them towards particular audiences. But in my mind, the goal of the author is to come up with an idea or a plot line or a character development or some kind of artistic core that they wish to convey to the audience, and then to harness all of the possible skills at their disposal, which may draw from multiple different genres, and to present them. And so for my work, I wanted to take an experience which I have had myself, which is as a doctor sometimes feeling overwhelmed with extraordinary challenges that are put before you. And I wanted to transport that to a much greater, almost cosmic and existential dimension by having the most extreme challenge being put before a doctor, which is to bring the dead back to life. And if that meant harnessing a variety of different genres, then so be it.
Another interesting aspect that I want to talk, it's about this discussion on God. You know that in India, a lot of discussions are going on, God, about God, around God. But here in this novel, the protagonist, the doctor, as well as the teacher, both, in a way, negate the existence of God. The doctor is an atheist. So he sees things from a very scientific point of view. And the teacher who has returned from the afterlife, he is depicting an entirely different picture of paradise. Something in all our scriptures, all our religious books, it is painted as a very colorful place, but what the teacher depicts, it's an entirely different picture. So maybe I think you can read from that portion.
Yes, so in that portion of the book that you mentioned, later in the story, the surgeon tries to understand why the dead wish to return to life. And one of the things he tries to pry to the teacher, who is the dead man who has returned, is, why do you want to come back? What exactly is it about the afterlife that makes you want to come back? And the teacher first gives answers that don't satisfy the surgeon. And then eventually he relents, and this is what he says. The afterlife is a barren place, Dr. Sahib. There is no valley or mountain to catch your eye. Every direction looks like every other. You could walk up and down it forever, and so many have. The dead who don't even know why they're wandering anymore. Who would want to live in a place like that, Sahib? It's like being exiled to a desert. Worse, all you can do there is wander, hope that relief will come if we walk just a bit more, find some magical resting place. Our legs don't get tired, we don't need food or sleep, but the soul, it gets tired. It wants to feel something, even pain. But that doesn't answer my question, said the doctor. You, all three of you, could live here till you're old and bent, and after everything is done, you'll still end up there. So how is this, all this suffering you'll have to face? How is any of this worth it? It will be worth it, Sahib, I'm telling you. The suffering will be temporary. It will go away. And then we'll be able to feel things again, all the little things that we can only feel on earth. I want to drink water again, Sahib, ice cold water. Sometimes I imagine it's collecting on my tongue, that I can roll it against my teeth, feel it in the bones of my head, smell it. Water has smell. I never realized that before my death. And then feel it in my throat while I swallow, that feeling right here in my chest, spreading outwards, rib after rib, down to my stomach. I know I must sound half mad when I talk like this, but it's these things that really separate life from death. Yes, I'll have to return there again someday, but now that I know what it's like, the time I spend on earth will be different. I know the value of every breath. I will live a life in which I teach others to appreciate it, help them lead better lives themselves, maybe even become a farmer, grow my own food so that I know what it's like to sow life into the soil. All of these things, maybe they'll help me tolerate the life better when I return.
You know, we are taught to believe that heaven, it's a place where you get everything. It's such a lovely place, everybody wants to go there. But here the teacher says that even a mundane activity like drinking a glass of water seems very valuable. He wants to come back, he wants to do something for the other people, he wants to drink a glass of water, and he says even water has got smell. That's another interesting aspect that I came across, how you describe smell. There is this smell of water you are describing, then there is the smell of the womb, the amniotic fluid. So you are delving into all those areas. So talking about religion, what is your personal take on religion, God?
Oh, well, that's an interesting question. So I actually personally have been an atheist since I was about 13. I would say that's the case for most scientists that I've spoken to. It's not the case of most doctors. Actually, a good number of doctors tend to be theists. That said, I find myself fascinated by religion because of, I think the reason religion persists and the reason why it holds a sense of appeal to so many people is because it makes attempts, perhaps not good attempts, perhaps not effective attempts, but attempts to answer some of the deepest questions that plague all of us, which are, who are we? Where did we come from? Where are we going? What is our purpose? How must we treat each other? in the world. And some of these questions can be addressed by science, some of these questions can be addressed by philosophy, and religion does try to address them, and it often does them in very imaginative ways. So there's actually a good amount of religion and theological philosophy in both of my, and speculation in both of my books, because I just find the approaches that religion take to answering some of the complex questions of our lives very fascinating.
You might have come across or read about the Science Congress and the reports that occurred in India, where they are claiming that we had test tube babies. I mean, the Kauravas were test tube babies, or Lord Ganesha was had plastic surgery. So how does your colleagues react to this? You are from India, and this news is coming from India. So how do they react to such news?
So you are referring to recent news that at an Indian Science Congress, there were some speakers at an ostensibly scientific conference who were saying that Gandhari had 100 children. The fact that Gandhari had 100 children in the Mahabharata means that India had test tube baby technology at the time. And this keeps coming in waves all the time. I think personally that this indicates a deep insecurity among Indians about our own identity, about our roots. There's an enormous amount of literary wisdom and philosophical wisdom, mathematical wisdom, and I think it's excellent to go back to that and look at our heritage and say this is what we did before anyone in the world did, before the Greeks perhaps, or before, certainly before Europe got to these insights. But when we fabricate knowledge in this kind of way, I think we do a disservice to our own tradition and to our culture. And what it does is it presents Indian science as being non-serious to the world. China is in a way India's parallel, a country that is rising both economically and scientifically. But what China has done is they have spent enormous amounts of money to build scientific institutes, to recruit back scientists who are trained abroad. And now, over the last 5 years, I have begun to see scientific articles coming from Chinese laboratories in the top journals like Nature, Science, the top scientific journals. You're beginning to see research from China. So China is not saying, well, Confucius answered all of the questions that were there. Why do we need to do any more research? Because everything we knew was already known 2,000 years ago. And I think Indians need to be more secure in their identity and realize that we need to enter the 21st century, and especially Indian science needs to enter the 21st century.
Maybe I'll ask a very cliched question. How do you find time to write novel? You said you have started writing your third novel already. You are a very busy doctor, you are doing your research, still you find time to write. So how do you manage?
Well, I think there's a cliche that if you want to get something done, you should give it to a busy person, because a busy person will always find a way to get it done. I personally, I would say it's not easy, because as you know, as a writer, in order to write, you have to get into a certain kind of mental space. We have to disconnect from the world and immerse yourself in the ambiance of the book. And I think it's doable, but you do have to block out periods of time in the week on your schedule, and then just sit and do nothing but try to write during that time. And I try to do that at least on weekends, some evenings if I can.
The medical part in the novel sounds or reads very convincing, very realistic. When I read that, it was like I was there in that theater performing the surgery. I could feel the internal organs, so that was very convincing. Maybe being a doctor, you could write it very easily. I especially noted one sentence, like you are describing the birth of a child, and where you are not romanticizing that, not at all. You wrote two howling heads washed in fountains of blood. So that is not how we, maybe, I have not come across such a comparison. Normally we romanticize the birth of a child, but here you are describing it in a very harsh reality. So you see a lot of trauma, you specialize in leukemia. So that is one world where you are on a day-to-day basis faced with so much harsh realities. And do you get the energy from that to produce something very creative, very different? Or is it like a break from that and you are creating something out of that?
Well, I can try to address maybe a slightly related question, which is exactly how does my medicine relate to my writing? And I think one of the things that really fascinates me is that, you know, there's a constant duality in us human beings about how we think of ourselves. On one level, we are imaginative creatures, we are thinking creatures, we are poetic creatures, we are creatures that are capable of morality and literature. But on the other hand, we are also creatures who are made up of bones and muscles, and we are covered with skin, and we have viscera. We are both cerebral creatures and visceral creatures, and this duality between these two aspects is a tension that actually is very interesting to me, because René Descartes, the French mathematician and philosopher, he presented an idea of human minds as being of a completely separate substance from their bodies, and so it's often referred to as Cartesian. The term Cartesian dualism comes from that, where our minds are a separate substance from our bodies. But we know that that's not true, because all you have to do is infuse some alcohol into the body, which is the bloodstream, and you will immediately see a difference in the mind. Or introduce an infection or a variety of different chemical substances, and you will see differences in the way the mind functions. And so I think this tension in the ways in which we humans see themselves is actually, and I should say in medicine, you are constantly seeing that tension. You're constantly seeing an individual who's a functional, thinking person one moment, and then is completely changed personality-wise because of their disease. And that is something that really fascinates me. So that's actually at the core of a lot of my writing.
And in one of your interviews, you mentioned that while editing, you listen to music. So could you tell us about that?
Well, I have, so what I mentioned is that when I'm editing a book, I sometimes find it helpful to play a piece of music that creates a particular ambiance, because then it gives you a certain kind of mood to which you can aim. It's very difficult to explain. All I can say is that it works for me. Perhaps there are other authors in the audience for whom it works. But I found that if there's a particular kind of atmospheric goal I'm aiming for, I listen to a certain piece of music that I think captures that kind of atmosphere, and then I try to match the texture of the writing and the texture of the words to the music that I'm listening to.
In this novel, the character says that you can combine letters in any way possible, and you can say even outrageous things. So as an author, my question is it possible to say anything outrageous?
Are you asking, is it possible to say anything outrageous, or is it wise to say anything outrageous?
No, my question is, you are settled in the US, so maybe that gives you a kind of insulation to say whatever you feel like, or write, where the situation could be very different if you were in India, especially nowadays.
Well, that's an interesting question that you ask. So I think what you're asking is, what are the things that an author is permitted to say in a society? And I should say that over the last, so I was at the Kolkata Literary Fest last year, and even at this Lit Fest with the sessions I attended, one of the major themes has been the shrinking of space for the author to speak their mind, to be critical of religion, to be critical of morality, to be critical of structures of power. And I think that is very problematic. I mean, of course, this is not new. You know, this Satanic Verses by Salman Rushdie was banned in 1984, and so this has clearly been going on for quite some time in India. But I do feel qualitatively in the last 5 years there has been an acceleration in the level, the sort of the intensity of threats, the frequency of threats that authors have been getting. So you're right. I mean, there are certain controversial, problematic things that I can say in this book. And I do live in the United States, where the freedom of speech is taken very seriously, and where the law and but both the legal system as well as the government protects you and protects your right to say whatever you want. So yes, that is true. Although I hope that if I were living in India, I would still be able to write what I want to write.
So you have been living in the United States for the past 13, 14 years. But in this novel, the sensibility is very Indian. The characters are Indian. It is set in a rural background. So why is it set in a rural background? Even the cover of the book gives a glimpse into that, into the mood of that book. So why is it so? And none of the characters are named. It's the surgeon, the teacher, his wife, his 8-year-old child, the pharmacist. None of them are named. Their religion, caste, class, nothing is revealed. So could you tell us about that? Was that a conscious decision?
Yes, actually it was very much of a conscious decision. So in terms of setting it in rural India, I actually drew upon one particular experience that I'd had during my medical schooling. So we had something called a rural health rotation, where we were posted in a clinic in the village, and I was posted in a village that was about 3 hours from Mumbai. And as an intern who had no practical experience with medicine, I landed up in that clinic. And as the next day, the senior doctor who was there went on vacation. And so now here is little old me with only theoretical understanding of medicine, put in charge of the people in this village. And what if someone were to come in with an obstructed labor or appendicitis or something like that? What would I have done? And so in a sense that I have a very visceral memory of that period, and I tried to translate that into this book. And that was one of the reasons I decided to set this in a clinic in rural India. That said, I did want the book to have have universal appeal and have universal themes. And so I chose not to name any of the individuals. And I hope, you can decide as a reader, I hope that elevates the story beyond just the confines of the particular cultural and geographic locale of the book.
Now, moving on to Afflictions, your first novel, where you are discussing 15 peculiar diseases. So would you like to read from the book?
Sure. So I can just briefly describe the Affliction. So this is actually the HarperCollins cover. It's a really beautiful design that they made over here. And if you can look at it, it's actually a tile mosaic of a face. And it's showing this face as comprised of fragments, the human being as fragmented. And actually that's one of the major themes of this book. So it begins with, the book is set in an imaginary medieval library. And it begins with the librarian leading a young apprentice through this library and exploring the different works that are in this library. And the treasure of this library is the Medical Encyclopedia, which is a collection of all the medical knowledge of the time. And so the book is actually made up of, the characters in the book are not important. The book is actually made up of 50 different descriptions, vignettes of diseases listed in this encyclopedia. So I can read two of them.
While reading the book, I thought all these diseases were real, and I was trying hard to read the names of those diseases, but you said it's not. It's imaginary.
Yeah, so these are all imaginary diseases, but Shahina tells me that when she read them, many of them felt as if they could be real. So I'll read out two diseases. So the first one is called Immortalitas Diabolica, or immortalitas means immortality, and diabolica comes from diabolical, which you're familiar with, and so it's the name of the disease basically is diabolical immortality. Immortalitas diabolica is poorly documented, for no one will admit to suffering from it. The authorities become suspicious, however, when villages whisper of an inhabitant with obscene youthfulness, free of the illnesses and deformities that have visited everyone else his age. Immortalitas diabolica grants its victims the ability to will away every pain and infirmity that befalls them. The ability first surfaces in childhood, when the instantaneous cure of scrapes and fevers seems as natural to them as speaking. As they grow, they see those around them suffer through illnesses that they themselves can dispel with a fleeting thought. They acquire a reputation for remarkable health, but it is not until the 4th and 5th decades of their lives that people around them question their pristine skin, their robust teeth, their luminous hair. It is usually then that the invalid learns the terrible truth about his health. Immortalitas diabolica does not cure afflictions, it transfers them to the bodies of others. When a person with this power reaches within himself to expunge his illness, its vapors leave his body and settle on some innocent passerby, who must now suffer an illness fate did not ordain for him. As the person with immortalitas diabolica ages, the legacy of the gift weighs heavier upon him, and while he can effortlessly banish diseases that threaten his body, he cannot banish the memories of those whose lives he has blighted. Some people with immortalitas diabolica try to reject the gift, allowing wrinkles to line their faces, scars to riddle their lungs, cancers to flourish in their guts. But when the terminal moments of agony and suffocation arrive, Lucifer rages in their minds. Intoxicating with pain, they stagger then into dingy alleys, to the huts of the poor and the destitute who are unlikely to be missed, and they allow themselves to drink from the monstrous elixir that swirls within. When the deed is done, their young, muscular legs whisk them away as cries emerge from the windows beside which they stood. Nevertheless, those cursed with immortalitas diabolica are not truly immortal. After extraordinarily long lives, they die of causes unknown. Necropsy reveals youthful, supple tissues, a body that appears to have expired at the peak of health. Spasms of the heart, poisons in the blood, or other fatal chances too sudden to be wished away may lie behind these deaths, but some authorities suggest that the mechanism may not be so simple. They argue that sickness and suffering are integral to the human soul, so a person with immortalitas diabolica must forsake fragments of his soul each time he expunges an illness. It is then only a matter of time before the soul is ground to dust, and all that remains is a body in pristine repair, devoid of any vital force to sustain it. So that's immortalitas diabolica. And I'll read one other, which is morbus geographicus. So morbus means disease, geographicus means geographical. And so it's a geographical disease. The victim of morbus geographicus complains of a cluster of unrelated symptoms: edema of the limbs, spasms of the gut, inflammation of the lungs. His physicians, perplexed, refer him to experts in other towns. The symptoms wax and wane as the invalid makes his travels. Few practitioners know of this disorder, and years may pass without a diagnosis. At last, a rare physician who's trained in both cartography and medicine takes the time to comb through the documentation of his peers and find correlation between each symptom and the town in which it was recorded. He refers to maps and charts, compasses and scales, and after careful triangulation prescribes the land that will bring relief to the sufferer. Morbus geographicus allots its victims a radius on earth within which they may thrive. Any travel beyond its boundaries makes the symptoms recur. The locations are unpredictable. A farmer may be banished to a barren and salty plain, a man of letters to an illiterate village, a councilman to a mountain where he can only preside over wild goats. It is there, however, that the invalid must rebuild his life, fenced in by his disease. But the initial migration does not cure morbus geographicus. New pains arise with time, and the invalid must then travel to neighboring towns and record the precise intensity of each symptom at each location. He must send these details to the cartographer physician, who uses them to calculate that the allotted region, for reasons unknown, has shifted. The invalid, in order to soothe his new ills, must detach himself from the land in which he has begun to take root and migrate as morbus geographicus commands. He must cross oceans and continents, pass through lands whose languages he does not speak and whose customs he does not understand, and at last accept the melancholy task of settling into a new house, pretending that its walls will protect him from the world, when in reality the germ of disease within him turns every wall on earth to paper. The invalid becomes a palimpsest, his life etched with layer upon layer of new scenery, until he wonders if there is anything beneath it all. And then, one day, the trajectory folds in on itself and leads him back to the land of his birth, announcing the end of both his travels and his existence.
So that library you mentioned, that is also fictitious.
Yes, the entire book is fictional. The library, the encyclopedia, and all of the diseases are all fictional constructs.
When you read it, it feels like a medical journal. I thought it was real, and you just wrote about that character and librarian. That was your creation. I thought there is such a library and there is such a medical encyclopedia. So it's quite interesting how you come up with so many things in that book. So before moving on to the questions from the audience, let me thank Dr. Vikram Paralker for gifting me the signed copies of his books, which was not available here. I hope DC will have the books by tomorrow.
I think so.
Thank you so much. And now I'll take questions from the audience.
So nice hearing you, Dr. Vikram. And you are now living in US, and you have taken the theme from India, from the rural villages. I understand by this interview. And how do you look about India today? We are keen to know about that, because now just you are living over there in US and you can write whatever you feels okay, but you can see how India is moving forward, especially our states. What is your opinion, or how do you look about the situation over here? The second thought went through me is, there are doctors working here, like oncologists, surgeons and all, but they don't dare write like, how do you do that? And how do you compare yourself with the physicians or surgeons over here with their creative input, or how they take their profession as a background to write these creative fictions and all?
Okay, so I guess I'll answer the first question first, which you asked, how do I look at India today? The reason I decided to move to the United States personally, I can just tell you my personal perspective, is because I wanted to be a scientist, and the career track of being a physician scientist simply doesn't exist in India, and the kind of research infrastructure you need to be a physician scientist does not exist. But I see India as a land of great potential that is, I think, on the razor's edge, because we are, there are two things that I think are really problematic about India, and how those will go in the next 20, 30 years probably will determine the future of the country. The first is the space for free speech and free expression in this country, and a certain sense of rising religious intolerance from every religion in the country. There's sort of a hardening of perspectives. People are putting up their ramparts because they feel they're attacked by the other side, and if they even open the liberal doors a little bit more, the other side will attack them. So that's one of the problems that I see. And I hope it can, I guess that's where the role of the writers in this country comes in. The writers have always been the people who are pushing the boundaries of what can be said. And one writer can be attacked, but all writers cannot be attacked. And so I think what it calls for is solidarity between writers to be able to push against this. The second thing I think is the level of corruption in the country is truly problematic. It's actually one of the major themes in my book. And just to give you an idea of level of corruption and the extent to which it has even entered the medical profession. When my parents started practicing medicine, both of my parents are doctors, when they started practicing about 40 years ago, there did not exist something called the cut practice. The cut practice basically is if a person refers you a patient, then you have to give a cut of the money you charge to the general practitioner. And then if the consultant refers a patient for an MRI, then the MRI radiologist gives the cut to the consultant. That did not exist at that point. Today, it's to the extent that doctors give an advance cut. So they give an advance amount of money to the GP and say, oh, this is an advance on the cut that you're going to get, please refer me patients. And I think this creates a situation, it creates an equilibrium where corruption is rewarded and honesty is penalized. And I think that's a very dangerous system because it, I don't think there's anything different about people who are living in the United States versus in India, but I do think the systems of the equilibrium of reward and punishment are aligned in such a way that it incentivizes corruption in India. And I think the direction where this will go again in the next 30 years will make a difference. In terms of doctors who write, I personally don't really think of myself as a doctor who writes. I'm a doctor and I'm a writer, and I hope you can judge the work as a piece of writing. You don't have to give me any bonus points or be lenient on your critique of my book because I'm a doctor.
And now, as a small token of gratitude, we would like to invite Shashi Kumar sir to present this gift from KLF, the crew of KLF.